History Class with Dr. W, and our discussion of the year 1968. We've been talking about the Vietnam War, and in the previous couple of lectures, I've talked about some of the background in that war in the 1950s and early 1960s, through the Kennedy presidency and into the Lyndon Johnson years. In this lecture, as we lead up to our discussion of the Tet Offensive of January 1968, I'll talk more about the Vietnam War during its peak years, 1965 to 1967, and many of the factors that become critically important as we approach the Tet Offensive itself. Despite the many challenges confronting American forces in Vietnam that I talked about at the end of the previous lecture, American General William Westmoreland drew up a strategy in 3 stages that would guide American involvement until the Tet Offensive in 1968. Stage 1 was to secure the situation and establish the infrastructure necessary to support a large modern army. Stage 2, which began in late 1966, was to establish fortified bases in South Vietnam and expand operations out from those bases. This element comes to be known broadly as search and destroy, which I'll talk about more in a few minutes. And finally, the final stage, stage 3, would come to be called Vietnamization and involve South Vietnamese troops taking over the war for themselves and essentially cleaning up the operation as American forces began to leave. Under this strategy, Westmoreland was convinced that the United States would win a war of attrition and that North Vietnam would crack first. As he said, "We'll just go on bleeding them until Hanoi wakes up to the fact that they have bled their country to the point of national disaster for generations." This strategy also employed a deep, unwavering belief in the supremacy of American technology. Defeat was simply unthinkable. Superior technology and firepower must inevitably produce victory. By that logic, it was also pointless to try to learn about the history and culture of Vietnam. Such things were irrelevant, as we were essentially just bombing the enemy into submission. The United States had varying degrees of success in meeting these 3 stages of Westmoreland's strategy. The first, establishing an infrastructure, the Americans achieved remarkable things. The American military bases in Vietnam were spectacular marvels of modern technology and included all manner of very modern elements. Stage 2, search and destroy, essentially leads us into the period that I'm discussing in these lectures, the abyss, this period from 1965 to 67 or 68, beset with many challenges and problems. And stage 3 as well, Vietnamization, preparing the South Vietnamese to take over the effort for themselves. While the United States did eventually leave Vietnam, it took far longer than Westmoreland anticipated, and ultimately was a much messier exit. We never really adequately prepared the South Vietnamese to take over the effort for themselves. In the meantime, the United States meandered deeper and deeper into this conflict. By the end of 1965, American troop totals numbered about 184,300. There were already 636 Americans killed and about 10 times that number wounded, and so this was becoming a very serious conflict for the United States. The body counts, which I talked about in the previous lecture, appeared to deliver the Americans victory, as they inflicted far more killed and wounded upon the enemy as they suffered themselves. And yet this appearance of victory made us no closer to actually achieving victory. And Lyndon Johnson, while publicly appearing confident in America's fate, privately was frustrated and confused. By the summer of 1966, at one point, he confided to the First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, "Victory after victory really doesn't mean victory. I can't get out. I can't finish it with what I've got. So what the hell do I do?" At the same time, the deepening conflict led to deeper opposition on the home front. and a small handful of those speaking out against American involvement in Vietnam began to grow into a much greater swell by the mid to late 1960s. And of course, opposition to the Vietnam War and the massive protests against the war will become a hallmark of our year 1968. Part of the opposition revolved around a phrase that was used in growing frequency: the credibility gap. It just became harder and harder to believe what President Johnson and many of his supporters and others in the administration were saying, because reality on the ground simply did not reflect what they were telling us about the situation. And again, this credibility gap, the lack of confidence and trust in the president, becomes another important feature of the protests in 1968. The news coming out of Vietnam continued to grow grimmer as the 60s went on. It was evident that the bombing campaigns had failed to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and that the enemy, rather than weakening in strength, was continuing to grow. In 1963, the trail had been primitive, one tiny trail winding through the jungles. The process took almost a month for troops to move from north to south. And yet, by 1965, the North Vietnamese were able to move 5,000 men and 400 tons of supplies from north to south every month. And by 1967, it's estimated there were some 12,000 trucks on the road at all times around the clock on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. While the American bombing campaigns in Vietnam were massive and inflicted major damage in the countrysides and on the villages, they were not as effective as Lyndon Johnson had hoped, and it became clear that the Americans were not going to be able to simply bomb their way to victory. There were many reasons for this, one of which is that the North Vietnamese economy was largely agricultural. While it was fairly easy to bomb industrial centers into oblivion, and this was done and did hurt the North Vietnamese economy, at the same time the North Vietnamese were able to evacuate much of their population out of the cities and into the countryside, and it's much more difficult when you're simply bombing fields and forests and jungles to achieve noteworthy victories in that way. The North Vietnamese were also able to rebuild, in many cases almost immediately, anything meaningful that was destroyed. Roads and bridges were very quickly replaced, and there were teams of workers at all times in the process of rebuilding things that had been destroyed. Now, at the same time, there were successes. The bombing runs certainly did have an impact. They were estimated to kill or wound almost 3,000 North Vietnamese every month in 1967, and most of the major cities were badly damaged, and industry was set back, in some cases by decades. But they always had agriculture, they always had food to come back to, and the people grew more and more determined over time. The bombing runs also confronted challenges, one of the main ones being weather, which was often very bad in Vietnam. Trucks and ground troops of the North Vietnamese could continue moving even while American bombers were grounded for rain or poor visibility, and it was impossible to stop the flood of supplies and troops moving from north to south. The North Vietnamese also improved their air defenses relatively quickly. In some cases, they used Soviet surface-to-air missiles and trained some pilots of their own. There were ultimately some 7,000 anti-aircraft batteries, and literally millions of people trained their automatic and semi-automatic weapons on American aircraft flying overhead. So American pilots had to fly at higher altitudes and were more likely to miss targets that were already difficult to hit. Finally, the air war had a negative psychological effect in the United States. As pilots shot down in Vietnam became prisoners of war, eventually growing in number into the hundreds and even thousands. This became a strong incentive for the United States to negotiate, and over time eroded popular support for the war at home. Another method that was employed by the United States was defoliation, trying to simply clear large stretches of land, often by dropping chemicals on the countryside. This obviously had disastrous environmental effects and had a negative impact on any people who were struck by these chemicals on the ground, including at times American soldiers. And while they did succeed in clearing millions of acres of jungle and foliage, the strategy itself is dubious and had a reverse effect of removing potential ground cover that American soldiers could use in the field. So, while they did have, again, grave effects, it's unclear whether this strategy of defoliation actually helped Americans in their strategies to win the war itself. The major American tactic used during this period was search and destroy. Throughout 1966 and 67, this was the vast majority of American involvement in Vietnam. The idea was that ground forces would be airlifted into an area where the enemy was suspected to be. They would seek out, search, and find the enemy, and then they would call in artillery and airstrikes, which would destroy the enemy. This put American troops at grave risk, often sending them into the midst of enemy strongholds, where they had little ability to defend themselves even after they discovered the enemy. And there were all kinds of other problems that I mentioned in the previous lecture. American troops in the field suffered with the rain and the weather, immersion in water. Their feet and other parts of their bodies became just soaked, and particularly their feet. Many suffered with foot rot, which was a major problem. They also encountered leeches and other animals in the wilderness and mosquitoes. Landmines were another major issue during the war and caused about 1/3 of all American casualties in the war. Of the search and destroy method, one American officer said, "You don't fight this fellow rifle to rifle. You locate him and back away. Blow the hell out of him and then police up." At the same time, there were many contradictions in this war that relied so much on massive firepower, helicopters, planes, bombings, and so on. For one thing, it was very loud. The enemy pretty much always knew where the American forces were. They could set off smoke steam to designate landing zones, and the enemy could see those and choose whether to engage or not. The enemy also observed helicopter flight patterns and understood where the Americans were likely to attack. They also listened in on radio traffic. There was constant chatter back and forth between soldiers in the field and minor officers in the ground or back in the camp. American chain of command required requesting permission to launch attacks and all this communication. And so, as one American officer said, the enemy knew everything there was to know about us. They knew when we were going to strike, where we were going to strike, under what conditions, ground, air, or naval. This kind of information permitted the enemy to achieve results out of all proportion to relative commitment of firepower. And finally, these massive bombing campaigns even provided some weapons for the enemy. There was always some portion of unexploded bombs or weapon. It's estimated about 2% of bombs, rather than blowing up, they just sort of splashed down into the mud or the water. These could be collected by the enemy and made into landmines, which again caused about 1/3 of all American casualties. As frustration mounted that American efforts seemed to lead us no closer to victory, William Westmoreland began employing more and more methods. Operation Ranch Hand, this attempt at defoliation of the countryside, reached its peak in 1967. All told, the Americans dumped more than 19 million gallons of chemical poison over 6 million acres of the countryside, ultimately exposing more than 20% of the entire land area of South Vietnam. And I would note once again, they're essentially bombing the countryside of their own allies in South Vietnam. It's also in this period that Westmoreland developed the idea of so-called free fire zones. In these areas, local Vietnamese would warn the civilians that an American attack was coming and give them time to leave. Then, anyone who was left at the time the Americans arrived was thought to be fair game. Obviously, there are many flaws in this method. Often the flyers that were dropped or messages delivered were given in English, and the population either could not or didn't read them. In other cases, they simply didn't get the word. You're relying on the messages getting out to evacuate this area. Others simply chose not to leave, ignoring the warnings and ignoring the impending attack. In many cases, mentioned again, they were particularly attached to the land and their homes. And in some cases, there might not have been enough warning given. The warning might come only a few minutes before American troops arrived to attack. As a final thought, the free fire zones in many cases were implemented throughout South Vietnam. So again, these are the villages of our friends and allies that we were invading and ultimately attacking and destroying. And these are the scenes that many Vietnam movies depict of American soldiers coming in with their Zippo lighters and burning down entire villages, poisoning the wells, salting the fields, and so on. This strategy is one of the key elements in the My Lai massacre, which becomes one of the most important episodes in Vietnam in 1968, which we'll talk much more about later in the course. So much of what the Americans were trying to accomplish in Vietnam, by late 1967, it was apparent that they were an utter failure. Not only was the United States not establishing a strong basis of political support in the South, it was driving away much of the population. So many have looked back at this period and asked, why didn't the Americans make more attempts at pacification efforts to win over the hearts and minds of those in the South? Certainly, there were efforts at pacification. The Americans invested in education and health programs and agricultural development. They eventually started a program called the New Life Hamlet program, which was a sort of variation on Kennedy's strategic Hamlet program, but as I've already discussed, these programs had serious problems and simply didn't work. There were other efforts to try to win over the hearts and minds of the South Vietnamese people. There were studies done of villages and surveys trying to meet the needs of the people. Ultimately, though, by the end of the war, for every dollar the Americans spent on pacification, they spent nearly 100 on military operations. They were spending about 100 times as much money destroying things as they were on building them. By the end of 1967, with all of these factors in play, William Westmoreland confidently predicted that the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese had reached what he called the crossover point, after which they would not be able to keep putting men in the field as fast as they lost them. He estimated that over 220,000 enemy troops were dead, and the number in the field was declining. By his calculus, it was only a matter of time before the Americans won this war. So that was the message that Americans were receiving as of the end of 1967. The United States was close to victory, the enemy was declining and on the run, and this war would soon be over. We'll soon see how things turned out in January of 1968.